My character study tonight will be over Simon the Cyrene. If you want to go ahead and the first place will be is in John chapter 19. John chapter 19. But I didn't really, some time ago, I was doing a bunch of character studies and thought about Simon the Cyrene, not really expecting to be able to get a 20, 30-minute lesson out of Simon the Cyrene because he's only mentioned in 3 verses in the New Testament. But you'd be surprised, I've got like 8.5 pages of stuff here. So, but John chapter 19, which as we read it, you may be like, why are we starting here? Because Simon the Cyrene's not even mentioned in John chapter 19. But if somebody has John 19, read verses 16 and 17 for us.
Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. Then they took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of a skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. All
right, so you ask, well, where's Simon? He's not even mentioned in the Gospel of John. He's mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but he's not here in the Gospel of John. It's the aim of the Gospel of John is kind of different than the other. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are synoptic Gospels, which that means they're kind of a synopsis. They're a summary of the events of Jesus' life. John is more theological, so John isn't as concerned with this event happened, then this event, then this event, and so he doesn't even mention Simon the Cyrene. But that doesn't mean that Simon the Cyrene was not there, because he is mentioned in all 3 other Gospels. Let's go to Matthew. Matthew chapter 27, verses 31 to 33. Matthew 27, verses 31 to 33. If somebody has that, read it for us, please.
When they had mocked him, they took the robe off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him away to be crucified. And as they came out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. And when they had come to a place called Golgotha, that is to say, place of skull.
And then verse 35 says they crucified him. So it's the same account that you have in John, except this Matthew mentions Simon the Cyrene, who was compelled to bear the cross of Jesus. So there's not any contradiction or any error there just because John doesn't mention Simon the Cyrene. John's aim was different. But we're told in Matthew that Jesus did bear his cross part of the way, and then Simon the Cyrene was compelled to carry it the rest of the way. So when Jesus came to the gate of the city, as they were going out of the city beyond the city wall where the crucifixion would occur, we're told that Christ, who had been bearing the cross, would have staggered under the weight of the beam that he bore, and Simon was called upon to carry it. And this was not the entire cross. You may have seen in movies or pictures of Jesus dragging the entire cross. And as big as those beams are, to carry an entire cross would have been, nobody, especially in Jesus' condition after he had been scourged and all that stuff, he would not have been able to bear an entire cross. So in the Roman times, the condemned person only carried the cross beam normally. And so, but even that, you're talking a beam big enough to hold the weight of a person. So it was still extremely heavily, like I said, especially for someone suffering from blood loss and exhaustion and all those things. So he needed someone to carry it for him. Verse 32 there in Matthew says, as they came out, they found a man. Well, ask yourself this question. What is it that caused the Romans to single out Simon the Cyrene from all the crowd. Remember, this was during Passover. So there would have been multitudes of Jews that had made the pilgrimage there to Jerusalem. Why do you think, does anybody know why they would single out this particular man? You preacher students might know, but all right. Well, I'll get to that later in the lesson. There's no spoilers yet, so even if you knew, you may have known and kept silent. But so they compelled him to carry the cross. That's the same word that is found in Matthew 5:41, where Jesus teaches that whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him too. The reference there is to the Romans, who were authorized to order any Jew to perform any service in the service of the Roman Empire. As the authority, the Jews as the subject people, the Roman centurion there, as they go out the city, he could have picked anybody. And they picked Simon the Cyrene and says, you're going to carry this guy's cross. Stop whatever you're doing and come, and we'll tell you when you're free to go. So the Latin word for compel comes from the Persian word, which means to be pressed into the service of the king. And it's kind of ironic. Simon had not realized it yet, but he had been pressed into the service of the man who would be his king, who is the King of Kings, the King of the universe. And you'll have to excuse me, there's several parts during this lesson where I'll probably get choked up, and that'll be your cue to make comments or something like that. But so can you imagine the emotions that were going through Simon the Cyrene at this time? Now remember, he's a Jewish man, probably a Jewish man there for the Passover, and he has just been singled out, chosen to carry the crossbeam for this criminal. For all he knew, this was just some criminal. So how do you think he would have felt at being singled out to do this? How would you have felt? Not knowing that it was the Savior of the world, of course, just some common criminal.
Kind of humiliating.
Right? He would have probably felt humiliated, shameful, maybe resentful. You know, like why me? But later in life, after he figured out who Jesus was, he may have still felt guilt at that time for, like, you know, putting myself in his place. I might have felt guilt. You know, I helped kill Jesus. I helped carry his crossbeam to his death. But possibly he may have also felt some pride, not sinful pride, but I got to help Jesus. He was meant to die. He came to this world to die, and possibly, you know, I helped him. I helped him. I was in service. I did service to the Lord of the universe. So, but any comments? Yeah.
His mindset will largely depend on how much he knew about Jesus. Which I don't know that. Well, I think we just kind of have to speculate.
Right. Him being from Cyrene, he probably did not know a whole lot. If he had just gotten there for Passover, depending on how long he had been in town for Passover, he may not have known. He may have heard rumors or gossip. But
the more he knew, the better he would have felt about it.
Right.
The less he knew, the worse.
Mm-hmm.
I like how you put it, he felt guilt, but then also that pride for helping. I mean, that's the same thing that we feel today, because we helped put him on that cross too. And every time we go back to the way we were before, we help put him on there again. But then we can also feel that joy every time we help someone else, either come to Christ or doing God's work. You know, we can have those same, you know, it's that balance of let's do his work well, and you know, I like
So just think about all the things that may have been running through Simon's mind there as he was carrying that crossbeam to Golgotha. So now let's look at the gospel, Luke's account. Turn over to Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23 in verses 25 and 26. Each of the gospel accounts adds a little bit more information for us about Simon the Cyrene. Luke 23, somebody read verses 25 and 26 for us.
And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon a Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus.
So Luke tells us that the crossbeam was taken off the back of Jesus and laid upon Simon, who bore it after him. That word where it says that he might bear it after Jesus means literally behind. So Jesus was in front of Simon the Cyrene, at this point staggering because of his condition, and Simon was behind him, following along, carrying that beam. So he walked behind the Lord bearing the cross. And as he walked, and only Luke tells us that Simon heard the words of the people that were in the procession. So Simon, at this point, Simon would be hearing things that other people in the procession were saying about this criminal that he was carrying the crossbeam for. Luke chapter 23 and verse 27, it says, "And there followed him a great company of people and of women, which also bewailed and lamented him." So these people and women, it says, were bewailing and lamenting Jesus. These are apparently people who were following along that thought that Jesus was not worthy of death. These may have been the sick and the lame that Jesus had healed there in Jerusalem during his time of ministry. And as they wailed and lamented him, Simon would have heard Jesus speak up in verse 28. And Jesus said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children." So Simon heard this convicted criminal when any other man would have been begging for mercy or weeping for himself. This guy, his concern was for the people around him and for the nation, for the people and their future. And so that, I would think that would have struck a note with Simon the Cyrene. This guy, this criminal that I'm carrying this crossbeam for, he's not concerned as so much for himself. He's worried about the other people. And so go on to verse 29. Luke chapter 23 and verse 29, it says, "For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us." So what was Jesus talking about there?
AD 70.
He was foretelling AD 70, the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, when Josephus spoke of blood running as a river down the streets of Jerusalem, the steps of the temple. So a huge, disastrous calamity was coming, and Jesus, in his foreknowledge, was prophesying about this calamity that would come. But even then, he was more concerned about his people more than about his own impending death. That selflessness would have had an effect on Simon the Cyrene. So verses 31 and 32 there in Luke chapter 23, it says, "For if they do these things in the green wood, what will be done in the dry? There were also two others, criminals, led with him to be put to death." And then in verse 33, it says, "When they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And they divided his garments and cast lots. So Simon carried that crossbeam all the way to the hill of Golgotha, the hill of Calvary. And so you could assume that he was probably still there when Jesus made that statement, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. This prayer of forgiveness. Simon, there on Golgotha, he would have had to kneel down. They would have taken the crossbeam off his back. They would have, the main upright part of the cross would have already been there. They would have laid the crossbeam across it. They would have driven the nails through the hands and feet of Jesus, and then stood that cross up and dropped it into the hole, which was agony, just adding agony to agony by dropping it into the hole where it would stand upright. You can imagine your hands and feet being nailed, dropping 3 feet into a hole, the jar that would come from that. But Simon the Cyrene was witness to these things. And he would have heard Jesus say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Again, Jesus praying not for himself, but for others. Any other man, any common criminal would have been praying for himself, crying out for mercy, weeping, calling for his mother. But Jesus was not just your run-of-the-mill common criminal. What Simon heard was that prayer of priestly intercession for others. And that must have astonished Simon as he saw the cross lifted up. So now let's go to the Gospel of, any questions before we move on to the Gospel of Mark? All right, turn over to Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15, verses 20 to 22. And only Mark's Gospel tells us that this was in fact, a life-changing experience for Simon. It says, Mark 15 says something that none of the other gospel accounts mention. So if somebody has Mark 15, verses 20 to 22, please read that for us.
And when they had marked him, they took the purple apron, put his own clothes on him, and led him out to crucify him. Then they compelled a certain man, Simon, a centurion, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by to bear his cross. And they brought him to the place of Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. Then they gave him wine mingled with myrrh to drink, but he did not take it.
All right, thank you. Did you notice what verse 21 said? It says they compelled a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, as he was coming out of the country and passing by. So only Mark words it in this way, that Simon was passing by. What Mark is telling us is that Simon was coming out of the countryside into the city of Jerusalem, while Jesus was coming out of the city, going out of the city towards the hill of Calvary. These two men were traveling in opposite directions on that day. Simon was coming in and the Lord was going out. But what we're being told is that Simon, who was walking into the city, suddenly found himself turned around at the instructions of the centurion, and he finds his life walking in exactly the opposite direction that he had been going. For Simon, meeting Christ on the way to his crucifixion, this was going to turn his life literally completely around. His experience of meeting the Lord would change the rest of his life to walk in the opposite direction. And isn't that what repentance, salvation is all about? Changing the way you were going. It has to be you can't make a 45-degree change. It has to be a complete opposite direction. And Simon, literally, his life his direction was changed, literally and figuratively, there that day as he was coming in the city. So it's Mark's gospel that quotes from Isaiah chapter 53. In Mark chapter 15 and verse 28, it quotes Isaiah 53. It says, and he was numbered with the transgressors. So what was Isaiah 53?
It's about Christ.
Right, it's a messianic prophecy. Isaiah long ago prophesied about these things that would happen to the Messiah. And though those things were probably not spoken there on that day, Simon, being a Jew there for Passover, he would have been familiar with Isaiah 53, and because everyone was looking for the Messiah, and they knew all the prophecies about the Messiah. And when he saw all of these things happening to Jesus that day, I'm sure it began to click in his head. Hey, this is exactly what Isaiah 53 says will happen. So turn over to Isaiah chapter 53. And I'll read from verses 4 through 6. Isaiah 53, verses 4 through 6. It says, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And then skip down to verse 12, Isaiah 53 and verse 12. It says, therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So only these things would be rattling around inside Simon's head as he witnessed all those things that day. Only later would Simon realize that the man he had walked behind, thinking all the while that he had borne the beam for that man, that man was actually the Savior who had borne his iniquities. I can just imagine the first meeting of Simon and the Lord in terms of their eyes meeting. The Lord had stumbled, perhaps fallen to the ground because of the weight of the beam. And as Simon looked into the eyes of Christ, he would have been impressed that he didn't see the eyes of a guilty man. He didn't see the eyes of an angry man. He didn't even see the eyes of a defeated man. What Simon saw was a look of blazing determination to fulfill his destiny. This was a man who wanted to go to Golgotha, because that's what he had been born for. A man who wanted Simon to bear the cross and help him on to that destiny. So Simon would never forget that moment of contact with the Lord there on Golgotha. I think as we go through this lesson, I think we'll see that Simon was transformed by his contact with the suffering servant. I think the record will suggest to us that was so, because you see that Mark goes on to say that they compelled a certain man, Simon a Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by. Why would Mark bother to tell us that Alexander and Rufus are Simon's sons? Right. Who was Mark writing to? Romans, right. He was writing to a Roman audience. So, I mean, the newspapers today, if this account was in a newspaper, they wouldn't even bother to put Simon's name in there, much less Simon's sons, unless they were known by the people that were reading that newspaper, unless they were familiar with who these people would recognize the names. So Simon, Alexander, and Rufus, by the time Mark wrote his gospel, the people would have known exactly who these people were. They would have heard about these people. Presumably, the indication is that the family of Simon had gone on to obey the gospel, that they had become Christians, and that the people that Mark was writing to knew those names as fellow brothers in Christ. They knew the sons in this family was a family of believers. So Mark's gospel being directed to the Romans, we'll see that significance again as we come to it later. But now, turn over to Acts chapter 11. Any comments or questions before we move on for that? We'll talk more about the sons of Simon in a moment. Any comments or questions? All right, turn over to Acts chapter 11. Acts chapter 11 and verse 19. We have this interesting comment concerning the effect of the persecution of the church. Acts 11 and verse 19, it says, "Now those who were scattered after the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch, preaching the word to no one but the Jews only." So that was the normal way of it. Thereafter, as the gospel began to spread, they would go first to the synagogues in every town they came to, and they would preach the Christ to the Jews that were there in the synagogues. Verse 20 there in Acts chapter 11 says, "But some of them were men from Cyprus and Cyrene, who, when they had come to Antioch, spoke to the Hellenists, preaching the Lord Jesus." So now this is, Acts chapter 11 is occurring in about AD 41 or 42. So we're 8-9 years after the crucifixion of Christ now. But it's important, it says that men from Cyprus and Cyrene came here to Antioch, and they did something different. They began to speak to the Hellenists. Who were the Hellenists?
Greek Jews.
They were Greeks, and they may not have even been Jews. You know, they were just Greek-speaking people, and they began to take the gospel to them as well. You know, there had been Cornelius had obeyed the gospel, but he would have been a God-fearer. He was not really a Hellenist, because he was actively going to the temple and giving alms and worshiping the one true God. But he had obeyed the gospel, but this was the first time that they had actually gone to people who were not of a Jewish background. So Antioch was the next great stage in the advance of the gospel from Jerusalem. The gospel went from Jerusalem to Samaria and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. And the first stage of the uttermost parts was Antioch. Antioch was the third largest city in the Roman Empire at that time. It wasn't just some small town. This was an important place. The interesting thing about what's going on in verse 20 there in Acts chapter 11, it says they spoke to the Hellenists. So these were real Gentiles. They spoke to the Gentiles for the first time, and they took the gospel to non-Jewish people there in Antioch. And Antioch would become the first truly Gentile church. So now, who was to make this enormous advance in the preaching of the cross of Christ to distant lands? The record says men of Cyprus and Cyrene. So why do we need to know that? Why did Luke include that in Acts chapter 11? Why should we know that it was men of Cyrene that were included in the preaching work that had now advanced the gospel to this place? Maybe we can see the shadow of Simon the Cyrene there. And there's other reasons to believe that he ended up in Antioch as well that we'll get to. Acts 11 and verse 21, it says, "And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number believed and turned to the Lord." Notice that word turned there in verse 21, turned to the Lord. The Greek word there means to turn utterly around and face the other way. That's a lot like what happened to Simon there as he was ordered to bear the cross. Who better to teach the people a dramatic change of life than Simon the Cyrene? What an account he would have to tell people. And as much as I get choked up just trying to read the lesson, just imagine Simon the Cyrene telling the story about what had happened to him and how it had changed his life and what Jesus was really like in the flesh then. Let's see. Oh, yeah. So look now to Acts chapter 13. Lost my place for a minute. So now look to Acts chapter 13, and here we have more evidence to believe that Simon the Cyrene's hand was involved there in Antioch. Acts 13, now this was in, Acts 13 is in about AD 47. So we're 14, 15 years after the crucifixion of Christ now. But Acts 13 in verse 1, it says, "Now in the church that was at Antioch, there were certain prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul." So notice the name of the first prophet there. It says Barnabas. From other scriptures, we know where Barnabas came from. Where did Barnabas come from?
Like Cyprus.
Cyprus, right. So Barnabas was one of these men of Cyprus that it said had taken the gospel there to Antioch. Now look at the third name, Lucius. Where does it say he is from? Cyrene.
That's Africa.
Right. So the man in the middle, Simeon, who was called Niger. It doesn't tell us where he came from, but you would assume, since we're dealing with the men of Cyprus and Cyrene that had carried the gospel to Antioch, you would think that the man in the middle, Simeon, who was called Niger, would be from either Cyprus, where Barnabas came from, or Cyrene, where Lucius came from. Simeon is just another variation of the name Simon. So which one do we think he was associated with? Cyprus or Cyrene? I think we're given a clue. We're told his surname or other given name was Niger. Simon Simeon, who was called Niger. And that word Niger means black. Simon the Black. If you've got a map in the back of your Bible, you can turn to it, and Cyrenaica, Cyrene, is along the northern coast of Africa. Turn to if you have maps of the New Testament where it shows the extent of the Roman Empire, you'll have to go along the southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea back to the west, and it's about halfway across. It would be almost due south from Italy. So, Simon the Cyrene was from Cyrenaica, which is on the northern coast of Africa. And here we have a Simeon who was called Niger, Simeon the Black. So, scholars, in my studies, I found that many scholars believe that Simeon, who was called Niger, and Simeon the Cyrene are in fact the same person. That Simon the Cyrene was probably a black man, and now why do we think that Simon was singled out to carry the cross of Jesus on that day? Maybe, possibly, he was the black man standing in the crowd. So was it prejudice on the part of the Roman soldier? They didn't have, their prejudices were not based really in the same ways that we have today, but there were other black people in the Roman Empire, subjects of the Roman Empire, but they would have been in the vast minority. So that may have been the reason that Simon the Cyrene was singled out that day. He was different. He was the black guy that was standing there, and so that soldier picked him out of the crowd to help carry the cross. So that's another reason for that Simon the Cyrene may have felt shame. He may have been even angry that I've been singled out because of the color of my skin to carry this cross for this criminal. But later he would have been, I'm sure, grateful that it helped him to serve the Christ and meet the Christ. So we have a wonderful story of how a man called for a moment of shame is turned in the providence of God towards the dramatic triumph of the story of his son Jesus. The truth, once it had begun from Jerusalem, went to Judea, to Samaria, to Antioch, and it wouldn't stop there. The advance of the gospel would never stop until it had gone in as far and as wide as the entire Roman Empire itself. The Roman Empire that had thought that it had conquered the world found, as time went on, that the gospel had conquered the Roman Empire. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 1, at Antioch are Simon the Black and Lucius, both of whom we were believed from Cyrene, and Barnabas of Cyprus. But also amongst them dwelling at that time in the church, at the end of verse 1, there is Saul. And this is important as we go forward, knowing that Saul was there at the same time in Antioch as this man that we believe was Simon the Cyrene, Simeon the Black. So now turn to Romans chapter 16. And we'll see why Saul, who came to be known as Paul, why Paul being there in Antioch at the same time as this Simeon the Black was important. Romans chapter 16 and verse 13. If somebody has that, read it for us, please.
Great Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine.
Right. So where else in the Bible do we see anybody else named Rufus? Here in Romans 16, and when Mark said in his gospel, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. And we know if Simeon the Black is the same person as Simon the Cyrene, they would have been together they would have known each other there in Antioch. And so now, as Paul is writing to the church in Rome, he greets Rufus. At the time when the Apostle Paul wrote the letter to the church in Rome, he had never been to Rome. So how did he know Rufus and his mother? Well, he must have met them somewhere on his journeys earlier. And if this is, in fact, the son of Simon the Cyrene, they would have known each other from there at Antioch. So now he is greeting him. Rufus and his mother have moved on and are now living in Rome and are members of the church there in Rome. So I think this is all the same family, except now Rufus and his mother are there in Rome. It doesn't mention Alexander, so you wonder what happened to Alexander, the son of Simon the Cyrene. Well, it's interesting that in 1941, a renowned and well-respected professor called Naaman Avagad was excavating a tomb in the Kidron Valley outside of Jerusalem. And when they broke open the tomb, they found pottery inside that dated it to the 1st century AD. And they found a number of ossuaries in the tomb. Does anybody know what an ossuary is?
A jar or a basket box.
Yes.
For bones.
Yes, it's a box for bones. They were carved out of stone, and the common Jewish practice was they buried someone in a tomb, and once the flesh had decayed, they would go in, take the bones, and put them all in this small little box, which would often have the name of the person carved on it. So these ossuaries that they found in this tomb, there were 12 names found on the ossuaries in the tomb. And what's interesting is that they were all in Greek, apart from one, which was in Hebrew. But the most interesting thing is that most of the Greek names that were found were not common in that area of Palestine. They were common Greek names among the Jewish community in Cyrenaica. And one of the sides of the box read Alexandros Simenos, which means Alexander, son of Simon. And then on the other side of the same box, it said Alexandros Cyrene, which means Alexander of Cyrenaica. The name Alexander is so rare in Jewish literature that the archaeologists came to the conclusions that this had to be the box, the burial chamber of none other than Alexander, the son of Simon the Cyrene, that's mentioned in the gospel. So he's buried there in Jerusalem, and they uncovered his box, And now maybe we understand why Alexander is not mentioned with Rufus in Romans chapter 16. He had died in Jerusalem. So stop and think about the significance of this. We have a son in the truth we believe was in Jerusalem, Alexander. If the rest of the family obeyed the gospel, Alexander probably did, because Alexander's name was mentioned there in Mark's gospel with Rufus. So he was probably a member of the church. So when Mark writes his gospel and refers to Alexander, they would all know, hey, that was Alexander, who used to be a member in the church here in Jerusalem. We knew that guy. You've got the father, Simon, who we believe had gone on to Antioch and helped establish that first truly Gentile church. And that man is accounted among the prophets of the gospel there in the church in Antioch. He would have been a champion of the cross. He would have been there, a witness to the things that happened at the cross, preaching Christ there in Antioch. Maybe Simon died in Antioch, we don't know, but he's not mentioned there in Romans. He was not able to move on to Rome with his wife and Rufus. In this one family of Simon the Cyrene is the story of the triumph of the gospel. A son in Jerusalem, a father in Antioch, a son and a mother in Rome. Through this one man and his immediate family members, they did what Jesus said in the Great Commission. Apparently they never returned to Cyrenaica. After meeting Jesus, they were all about preaching the gospel, wherever it took them, even to the seat of Caesar in Rome, to the throne of Satan himself, as they saw it there in Rome. So through this one man and his family, the gospel of the kingdom was preached in all the world, as Jesus commanded in Matthew chapter 24. So now turn over to Hebrews chapter 13. We're almost done. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 12 and 13. And this verse is important because the apostle uses a special word that we've already come across in our study concerning Simon the Cyrene. Hebrews 13, verses 12 and 13, it says, "Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach." You see that word, bearing his reproach, there in verse 13. That's the same word that's used in Luke 23 and verse 26, when it said they laid hold on Simon, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. So we, just like Simon, are asked to bear the cross and follow after Jesus. In the first century, you can imagine how important Simon the Cyrene would have become, in a sense. A prominent member of the church in Antioch, family in Rome as well, with this great witness, because he was a witness of Jesus. Matthew 16 and verse 24 says, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross." And Luke adds the word daily. Take up your cross daily and follow me. The first man to have done that in a very literal way was none other than Simon the Cyrene. We're all commanded to bear our cross. Bearing our cross doesn't simply mean being patient or showing fortitude or accepting the burden of responsibilities. There was only ever one reason why a person bore a cross. And what was that? You were going to your death. So the question is, how do we bear our cross after the manner of Simon the Cyrene? The answer is by accepting in the providence of God. Though we may not understand it, Simon didn't understand it there in the beginning. We may not understand why things are happening to us, but accepting the circumstances that come upon us that result in the crucifixion of the flesh, living sacrificially. Revelation 2:10, it says there, "Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life." We must take up our cross and follow Jesus even unto death. Romans 12 and verse 1 says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. I think this is the lesson of Simon the Cyrene, that only when we have shouldered our cross and borne it up and felt its burden and looked up and seen Christ ahead and we following in his steps, that is what transforms us and empowers us to go on and suffer with Jesus no matter what might come. We have to come to that moment in life that Simon came to. And Simon must have successfully instructed and motivated the rest of his family to come to that same realization, because they all seem to have become fervent believers and followers of Christ. So there on the hill of Calvary, Simon likely actually came into the contact with the blood of Jesus. He probably got Jesus' blood on him as they transferred the crossbeam or brushed up against him. That unique experience likely led him to coming to faith in Jesus. So him obeying the gospel may have taken place only a few weeks later on the day of Pentecost. In Acts chapter 2:10, it mentions men of Cyrene there being present that Peter preached the first gospel sermon to. If so, that would explain why Matthew, Mark, and Luke mentioned Simon by name, and that's why his two sons were mentioned there in Mark. And if the connection in Romans 16:13 is correct, his wife also became a Christian. And that would show that all four family members were Christians and well known to the Roman Christians within 25 years of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. To accomplish that feat would have required a strong faith and a missionary component. Apparently Simon believed in taking the gospel everywhere to everyone. That's a lesson that we can follow in our lives today. So, in the way of an invitation, before I offer the invitation, is there any other comments or questions before we? Okay. So, as a way of invitation, ask yourself, are you willing to take up the cross of Jesus? Maybe you've never taken up the cross of Jesus yet, but you desire to do so today for the first time. Then the invitation will be open as we sing number 517 will be the invitation song. But maybe you're already a Christian, but you have stumbled under the weight of the cross. Today is the time to get back up and shoulder that cross again and follow on in Jesus' footsteps. So the invitation is open as we stand and sing.